I believe this meeting is being recorded, and since this is our first recorded meeting and we have a new member, why don't we do a quick round of introductions? Just your name and why you're on the committee in one brief sentence. Mary Longacre, I'm a citizen-at-large member, and I have a geology degree and a background in business consulting and business process design. Peter, why don't we start down at the end with you?
Okay, Peter Brace.
Oh, Peter, you need a mic down there.
Okay.
Do you maybe want to move one seat in or something, or?
Just, you can share, just move it. Yeah,
It's-
it'll pull, yeah, it should.
Yeah.
Peter Brace, Nantucket, Harbor and Shellfish Advisory Board representative. Is that enough?
Yep.
Dr. Jen Carberg, I work for the Nantucket Conservation Foundation, and I'm representing the foundation on this board.
Gary Beller, I'm the Vice Chairman of the Advisory Committee for Non-Voting Taxpayers.
Fritz McClure, I'm appointed from the planning board, member of the planning board.
Dr. Sarah Boyce, I'm a citizen at large on this committee, and I'm the Director of Research and Education at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation.
Ian Golding, I'm taking over from David LaFleur, and who had a conflict in his scheduling, and I'm on the Conservation Commission.
Okay, and Matt Fee is our Select Board representative on the committee, and Graham Durovich is our final member at large. So just for those who might be watching in the future, that's the makeup of the committee. Let's talk briefly about the agenda. We are going to expand topic number 5, review and discussion of topics for future meetings. We also need to discuss our meeting time and date for 2020, so we just want to bring that up as well. Then the first item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes from our last meeting on November 19th. We have a couple of typos. Does anybody have any substantial changes to the minutes? Okay, typos. Fritz noted that Jeff Carlson's name is spelled with an O. Aquifer.
I apologize, Jeff.
Yeah. Aquifer does not have a C in it. A couple of notes under item number 1, under committee discussion, saying that the presentation is published on the committee website. I think the presentation will be published. I don't think it's there now. And on item number 3, discussion of the video of Mark Willett, Wannacomet Water Company Director, to Planning Board, available on town website. I'd like to include the link in the minutes when we get the opportunity to add that. And also the date was August 13th of 2018 of that presentation. It was not a recent event.
Do you have those again with the...
I have them written here, yeah. On item 3A, we are at capacity. We are at capacity now, but new permit for greater usage is pending. I'd like to say we are at the permitted capacity now, just to clarify that we're not at our water capacity, our aquifer capacity. And then 3D, I like the positivity. What are the treats? But I think that meant threats there. Yes, on 3D under questions, the second question, what are the treats, is the way it's written, and it should be what are the threats, I believe.
Threats.
Under public comment, I'm not sure if we normally record who made the comments. Is that something that we should add? I don't know the protocol for that. Any suggestions?
I think only the person's identified.
Okay. I know that public comment number 1 was from Edie Ray. And I'm scraping my memory on number 2. Does anybody have an attribution for that?
It was actually me, so
Okay.
not public comment, because it was
Okay,
me,
Yeah.
and I'm a member of the committee. So.
okay, great.
So
Yeah.
if it's public comment, I'll just
Yeah.
need to make sure people
Right,
identify
yeah.
who they are.
Yeah.
Before it's been kind of informal.
Exactly. Well, no, we're being more formal.
There's Matt.
Okay, with those changes, and Vince, I will send you the link for that video so we can add that in.
think I'm still missing one or two typos that you called out early on.
Under 3A and 3C, aquifer, get out this, the C comes out of the word aquifer. Okay. That and Jeff names, I think that's, and threat. Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Okay, do I have a motion to approve the minutes as corrected?
So moved.
Second.
Peter, second by Fritz. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Carries unanimously. Thank you. All right, so our first presentation is from Jeff Carlson about the Mass General Law, Chapter 91, which is the Wetland Protection Act. Jeff?
Just take over for Vince at the chair there. It's all right with everybody, so we can play the slides. So
Does this show up on the other TV as well, or do we?
it might. I don't know. I've never used the other TV, so we can certainly try.
Be a little bit easier for me, otherwise I can move.
I'm happy to wait if people want to adjust their seats.
Yeah.
I'm in no rush.
I'd agree with you.
Oh, there we go.
Oh, there it is.
Yay.
Kind of. It's a little out of focus.
Yeah.
Let me see if I
All right,
can't.
well, it's also kind of hard for me to read, even if it was in focus. So I will scoot over.
All right, so we'll try to get there. So, good afternoon again, everyone. I know I was at the last meeting, but I'll say hello again. I'm Jeff Carlson, the Natural Resources Director for the town. And Vincent Murray had asked if I just kind of gave a brief presentation on the Wetlands Protection Act and Chapter 91, which are two separate regulations, and they're administered a little bit differently. So as we go through, I'm happy to take questions along the way, but I want to try to leave as much time at the end for you guys to have questions as well and not take over the whole meeting. So I try to keep it as brief and simple as possible. Between Jen and Ian, you guys already have two experts on the Wetlands Protection Act, as they have both served multiple years on the Concom.
One, I defer to Jen on that one.
So hopefully we won't cover too much stuff in duplicate. So the two laws that we're kind of going to talk about, the first one, the Massachusetts Waterfront Protect Act, is Chapter 91, as we've all talked about it a little bit. And then the other two kind of pertinent regulations that we deal with in natural resources are the General Wetlands Protection Act, Mass General Law 131, Section 40. And then Nantucket was wise enough to create their own wetlands bylaw in 1978 under Chapter 136, and we administer both of those. So a little history on Chapter 91. Its original idea was to preserve the public use of tidelands and waterways, and it's one of Massachusetts' longest-standing regulations that dates back to the colonial ordinances of 1641 to 1647. And Chapter 91 as a program specifically was formally established in 1866. So anyone that tells you that their structure or their use predates the regulation, dollars to donuts, that's not going to be the case. It's, again, one of the very old ones that's around. And the original idea and kind of the three basic uses it was originally started with was for fishing, fouling, and navigating. And then later on in time, the oar strolling was added into the regulations to do. But it's a really great act, and it's really allowed for Nantucket specifically and in the coastal Massachusetts to maintain a lot of public access ways and provide a lot of public benefit when you wouldn't normally see it. So we'll break down kind of the areas of jurisdiction, but it's the regulation that has created things like stairs over docks. So when you're walking on the Monomoy shoreline, if you want to climb over Jimmy Stewart's Pier, there are stairs when the whole thing's in place to get over it and get around it, so you can still do. Or if you go to the Land Bank's property out on Orange Street, they've had to have the path that kind of detours around the dock where it gets intercepted through the marsh to be able to get around and have a continuous stretch of shoreline to navigate or stroll across. So there's four main areas of jurisdiction. The most common one is flowed tidelands. So flowed tidelands is any area of tidally influenced water that goes out to 3 miles within the Commonwealth. So this is the harbor, off of the eastern shore, western shore, anything below mean high water and out to 3 miles is subject to Chapter 91 jurisdiction in efforts to make sure that there's not hazards to navigation or projects that interfere with the public's ability to use the waterway itself. So just as an example, the Chapter 91 license for the town pier included some other public access components like the parking lot across the street in Washington Street for public access, as well as the pier, and then some of the other uses like the restrooms and things are also included in their license that are there. So that's a pretty classic example of Chapter 91 being applied in flowed tidelands. So a little more non-traditional filled tidelands, and I like to use this picture because a lot of people never think about projects like this. The Dreamland Theater is subject to a Chapter 91 license. As the original shoreline of the harbor kind of bisects the building, kind of where you see the offset in the building itself. So that structure, when it was redone and constructed, was required to be licensed through Chapter 91. And because of that license, their restrooms are open to the public for normal business hours. There's the park in the back. But those are structures that you see, and as that line moves through downtown, a lot of those structures that are there should have licenses if they don't. And some are kind of underway or being constructed. So that's one that we see, and that line is available all around, and we'll look at it in a second. The other ones that we have, and just three of the examples, all great ponds in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts are subject to Chapter 91. They're kind of treated the same way as flow tidelands for regulation purposes, but any projects that take place in the great ponds require Chapter 91 licensing. And then the last one that we don't really have applicable to here are non-tidal rivers and streams. So we don't really have any areas on Nantucket that are non-tidal rivers or streams that are navigable. We actually, through the Wetlands Protection Bylaw on island, don't have any declared rivers on Nantucket, so there's some very small streams, and if you can navigate those with a boat, I would love to see it. So those are the kind of the areas for there. There's a really great resource available to everyone called Morris, and it's the online, let's see if I can get it, the online resource information system, and I'll try to get it up for everybody. It includes a Chapter 91 layer specific, so if you ever have questions in jurisdiction on whether an area is subject to Chapter 91, let's just bring up one downtown. It's pretty easy to use. You just location search, and it brings you right to here. And then just to kind of show everyone how to do it, if you're curious to see where it is, and you can see where their jurisdictional layer is, under boundaries, you'll find one that's just called state, and it's kind of a hassle to get there, but then you can see there's the Public Waterfront Act here. You can just expand that open. And then they have all kinds of cool old high waters and jurisdiction. So we'll look at jurisdiction, and it will turn itself on slowly but surely here. I might have to zoom out and touch it. There it is. So you can see that jurisdiction line that we talked about for the Dreamland Theater. So everything kind of in this area on that line is subject to jurisdiction. So they show that island-wide, and if you ever have any questions, again, about that boundary, they can help you with that determination. They have a process if you want to file for determination or not. But again, the purpose of the act is to preserve the public's ability to access the waterfront. So anything that you're going to be doing in those areas is kind of focused in that direction. There are other alternatives if you can't provide direct access. There's monetary contributions that they ask for people to pay for public access. They do have signage requirements for any public access, so you'll see those around. Places like the White Elephant has a sign. Brant Point Marine has a sign. Great Harbor Yacht Club has their walkway and signage that kind of goes around. So those are the kind of programs that you see them roll out through Chapter 91. To apply for a Chapter 91 license, though, you have to have all of your other permitting done before. So any permits required from the Conservation Commission, you have to file. Any other water quality certificates, you have to file with that application. And it can be a bit of a process to go through. It can be kind of slow. So again, that's what it's for. All enforcement for that, unless designated by permit, is through the State Department of Environmental Protection and through their waterways program. So that's one of the little snafus that we have here is sometimes we report issues to them and they have to take action, and sometimes that can be a little slower than we all like. So,
Jeff, before you go, can you drag
Sure.
that picture down to children's in the yacht club? I want to see the line goes.
absolutely.
Yeah, just drag it. Where does it go? Show it, yeah. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so it runs through kind of to tie into Sarah and Jen's talk last time. I know they talked a little bit about the marsh that used to be on Easton Street and how that used to look. Is you can kind of see through that neighborhood, there are sections where this area where the white elephant is, and then along for a little portion across to it is all filled at this point. So a lot of those areas are subject to Chapter 91 as well. But it's also a really nice tool to see kind of what historically may have been in these areas that we've filled over time. And kind of give a little bit of a, detective work for some of the issues that we're having. So Morris is a really great tool. It's the same tool that has, not to give an extra plug for it, if you're looking for things like shoreline change transects, is all of those things are available in their data layers that are here. There's all kinds of great stuff. There's fisheries information out in the ocean. There's the ocean management plan data layers that show potential sites for offshore mining. Morris is a really awesome tool, and they do a really great job keeping it up to date. So I definitely encourage people to kind of check it out and play around on it and find all kinds of good stuff that you can in Morris. So kind of move through. Something that's a little bit more relevant to us locally, we have our local Conservation Commission, and our Conservation Commission, again, is tasked with being the primary permitting agency for the Massachusetts Wetlands Protection Act and our local wetlands bylaw. And those permits are required for any alteration of land within 100 feet of a specific resource area. So a little history on those. The Massachusetts Wetlands Protection Act came in thanks to the Federal Clean Water Act in 1972. And Massachusetts adopted their first Wetlands Protection Act at that time. And then Nantucket, like I said, adopted Chapter 136 in 1978. And both of those separate regulations, both of those the act and the bylaw, have been carrying separate regulations since the 80s to kind of interpret those rules and regulations. And really since about the mid-90s, there's been a really good job for people applying and putting together permits. There was kind of an early stretch in the 80s where a lot of permits that probably should have been applied for were not. That's not unique to Nantucket. That's kind of Massachusetts-wide that activity was going on. So to kind of break down more coastal areas is a little bit more germane to the committee. This is the list of coastal resource areas that are identified through the act, and we'll kind of run through each one of them a little bit individually for where they are, because some of the names are a little bit confusing or some questions to it. The first one that we see, the most regulated one, is Barrier Beach. So a Barrier Beach is an area that separates the ocean proper from a separate and distinct water body. Our most classic is kind of in the hall over here, where the ocean is separated from Nantucket Harbor by the area just north of Wawinnet. That's an area that does not allow for new development really of any kind, and just redevelopment of what's existing and maintenance of what's existing with some limited work and potential expansion through permitting. So this is kind of an all-inclusive. Land over the ocean is obviously obvious, so we'll skip it. But we do have coastal beach, coastal dune, and coastal bank. And these are the three that we probably see the most permitting activity when we talk about things like erosion control or coastal stabilization or vegetative plantings. We're usually dealing with these three primary resource areas. So the coastal beach is the area in between the high water line and the base of any other stable resource area like dune or bank. Dunes are the areas that are mobile. They're kind of typical to have things like American beach grass on them, but they're really typified by sand that's able to be moved by wind or water, and they kind of form those classic dune shapes. And then the coastal bank is glacially deposited material that's formed and provides kind of either one or two functions or both. And the two functions that the Conservation Commission is concerned with are providing sediment as a sediment source for the beach and the dunes, and also as a vertical barrier towards storms and storm protection. So that'd be things like flood control, Obviously, our most classic coastal bank, when people think about coastal banks on Nantucket, would be like the Sankaty Bluff, is kind of our most classic that contributes in both ways. But as we kind of move through the harbor, we see some, like in Pocomo, that aren't necessarily contributing sediment as much, but are providing that vertical barrier, and maybe as little as 3 to 4 feet high. So it's they really vary in shape and size and are kind of evaluated on a case-by-case basis. And then the last resource area that we probably see the most of and talk a lot about is the flood zone, or land subject to coastal storm flowage. So this is an area that's determined through FEMA mapping to be within the 100-year floodplain. We get a lot of questions about, well, what's the 100-year floodplain? And it's not necessarily an area that floods once every 100 years. It's the area that has a 1% chance of that occurring. So they set the flood elevation. You can see all of the numbers in zones. So there's AE7, AE9, AE8. The 7, 8, and 9 are the elevation that you can anticipate water reaching in a coastal flooding event. The area kind of in the southern part of the picture, the VE10, that is the velocity zone. So the velocity zone is that first area most impacted by flooding and by storm surge. And those areas are significant for Conservation Commission regulations, but also significant through the building code, where they call those specifically and have specific standards to deal with those. Just as kind of an example, the velocity zone at elevation 10 is set to also include a 2-foot freeboard above elevation 10 before you can really reach any of the utilities or structural members of the building. So that's why, as we see downtown, the buildings be adapted, whether it's in the Washington Street Extension area or in that new subdivision near Mariner Way, we've seen those buildings higher than what we've typically seen, because as the building code has changed and those flood elevations have come up, with the freeboard and those elevations changing, it's pushed all of those buildings up vertically to the bottom. So that's kind of what's driving that vertical change and that change in appearance.
Jeff?
Yes.
I'm just looking at the map. It looks like VE is water-based and AE is land-based. Is that a correct interpretation?
Yes and no. So VE, again, is that velocity zone that we see, and the red on the map is also, and that's the first area where you're seeing waves that are moving and storm surge that's moving with the full force of whatever flooding event or storm that's there. The AE zones are typically more interior, and I don't want to say it's more of a still water flooding event like it used to be modeled, where it was kind of a bathtub model coming up. But it's that second area in where you're no longer getting kind of the current or flow, and the storm surge tends to be less damaging than the initial hit. It's been broken up through other buildings or through surfaces or elevation change, and you don't see kind of the wind and current driven flood damage that you see in that immediate velocity zone that's there. So they're important distinguishings. And then you can kind of see the little sliver, the 0.2. That area there is what they call the X zone, and that is the 500-year floodplain. And why that's important is when we look at some of our mapping and we talk about things like storm tide pathways and other ways that water moves, and it's kind of interesting that I cut it off there, but I didn't mean to, is where Lily Street kind of comes together. When we looked at the storm tide pathway map last time with Jen and Sarah, those 500-year floodplains connect right on that street to get into Lily Pond. And that's where those areas become really significant for management, as we're looking at areas that, if managed correctly, you can try to prevent flooding into other areas, or you can capitalize on areas' natural ability to absorb flooding and try to encourage water to stay within the path that you want it to be in.
How do they determine VE versus AE?
So again, the VE versus AE, they look at surface topography, and then they also look at hazards or things that are in the way. I know it's really hard to see through there. The VE zones are usually the area closest near shore and then out into the water a bit. And then as they calculate that and model that, moving that inland, just the obstructions of buildings or bulkheads or roadways that start to slow down the actual current of the water or provide some sort of breakup to wind-driven waves is what moves it from the VE to the 8 zone.
Yeah, just when I was looking at the map, it just seemed kind of funny that it was there, and they were along Washington Street, etc. but they didn't really have them around the jetties. So I was trying to figure out why are they, or Halbert even.
Yeah, so we've asked this question a few times. So this map itself is of Hobart and Brant Point is what's different between Hobart and where the velocity zone ends. That red line actually follows pretty closely to where a lot of the installed bulkheads are on Hobart Avenue. So it's giving it that first breakup that reflects some of that wave energy off. And then you get kind of the overtopping of that causes the distiller water flooding in that AE9 zone. And that's pretty consistent. And you can see the areas where you get little bumps in and out or where the man-made structures differ in that area a little bit as well.
That makes sense.
Sure.
Yeah. So earlier you said that it was 100 feet from a resource area, the
Yes, sir.
jurisdiction. So, and now you're talking about the FEMA 100-year floodplain. So is it anything within 100 feet of the FEMA floodplain?
So the FEMA floodplain is the only resource area that we really don't observe buffer zones. You're either in it or you're not. And my next slide will actually talk about buffer zones a little bit more and what's permissible or not typically. So the flood zone is something that doesn't have a lot of performance standards and how the commission evaluates the flood zone. There's really only one, and that's when you start your project, if your lot can hold, this is a made up number, if your lot can hold 10,000 gallons of water, when you finish, you should really be able to hold that same amount of flood capacity that's there. You can't fill in, you can't create an island and displace your flood waters to someone else's. If you're in the flood zone, your lot has a certain storage capacity and you have to maintain that storage capacity as best possible, and that's what the commission's tasked with permitting to do.
So building within the 100-year floodplain is controlled by the local building code, or is it state building code?
It's the state building code. So we're on the 9th edition of the building code currently. And the building code includes things where you see in flood zones where you'll have, louvers or breakaway panels on foundations down in the flood zone to allow for the free passage of flood water beneath buildings, or a lot of buildings will be built on pilings to allow for that. There are some exceptions. Commercial structures have a little bit of allowance to maybe do a solid fill foundation, do something further. There are also other opportunities for different levels of storage. We don't really have a lot in residential neighborhoods like this, but off island you see things that are more common where water is displaced and they create areas to hold that same volume in an alternative area. So it varies a little bit from site to site, but typically the building code drives what types of foundations or what level of development is allowed in those building heights and things like that.
Just speaking in a practical way, anything on both sides of, say, Hobart Avenue, if it were a new structure, would have to be built higher, like that one building is now that's being...
Yes, sir. Anything there would have to, any new development or redevelopment above a certain threshold has to meet current building codes. I would say the percentage, but I don't always remember, and I would hate to give you a bad piece of information related to the building code because it's not my area of expertise. So back to buffer zones a little bit. I'll turn it over to Jen and Ian because they're the ones that had to deal with this for so long. This is a very typical plain Jane generality. So before everyone asks their specific question for something that they know it doesn't meet this, in typical, when we look at our resource area, so this is just looking at a coastal bank, our first area of concern is the resource area itself, and there's nothing that's allowed to be done in there unless you have a permit for an alteration. Then that area from 0 to 25 feet is an area that we call the undisturbed buffer zone, and that's an area where, best case scenario, everything is left to its own devices. So the vegetation isn't necessarily managed, there aren't structures allowed, it's left to buffer the resource area from the impacts of development. So the 25 to 50, as you move a little farther away, there's a few permissible activities, things like landscaping, grading, pervious patios or driveways, split rail fencing, things that are non-structural alterations that can be managed and not necessarily detract from the resource area itself. So moving out further, that 50 to 100 foot is where you start to see the ability to permit dwellings, decks, pools, structural fences like board fences, pool fences. those are the activities that are allowed by our local regulations between 50 and 100. So all of those, while still requiring a permit, if you wanted to build your house and you're outside of 50 feet, there's nothing in the regulations that deny you that right to do that. But the commission does hold the ability to condition things to meet performance standards as they see fit. So you may see conditions where lighting has to be directed away from resource areas, or runoff has to be directed away from resource areas, or things like that, to condition it to not have those negative impacts, even for structures within those areas, but those uses are typically permitted in those areas. And then the 100-foot is a limit of jurisdiction. So I always use this example. If you wanted to build whatever you want outside of 100, the Conservation Commission doesn't really have grounds to necessarily do anything about it per se. It's outside of there. The one thing of note is the Conservation Commission by regulation does require all septic leaching facilities to be outside of jurisdiction, with very few exceptions through waivers or something that's pre-existing. But any new construction doesn't allow for septic leach fields to be inside that 100-foot buffer zone. So that's significant a lot when we see, especially when we talk about areas adjacent to nitrogen sensitive areas, whether it's the harbor or great ponds or other streams, that maximizing that separation to those is really critical for those things. So that's a very basic. I mean, we could talk about waiver criteria and things to get waivers to that, but everyone would fall asleep by the time I got to the end of that.
And
Sure.
the enforcement of that, is that the Conservation Commission, or is it the building department that issues the permit? Who enforces these requirements?
Sure, so that's enforced through the Conservation Commission. There's kind of a two-pronged process to that. Is there are conservation agents named to the town. So I'm one of the conservation agents for the town. Joanne Dodd in our office is another one. And we're tasked for kind of on-the-ground enforcement, and any of our enforcement decisions at some point have to be ratified through the regular Conservation Commission meeting process. So the example we use, if there's something that's egregious that's going on, the agent can go out to a site, say, you guys have to stop, we can issue a cease and desist, and then essentially order them in to the next Conservation Commission meeting, knowing that the 7 members of the commission aren't just sitting around waiting for us to call and come save the day. So there are some powers granted that way. Conservation agents also have that same ability in the purpose of an emergency. So if you need to move your house, if coastal erosion has threatened it, or the example I like to use, when the sewer line broke downtown, we were able to issue an emergency permit to do some work within the flood zone there to get it fixed immediately and cover it permit-wise, and then when the commission met, to ratify it through that process. So there's a little bit of latitude in both those ways, but it's a nice check and balance because it's something where the agent just can't run around and enforce and not have a check on it and order people to do work. It's something that the way we like to do it here is we'll bring someone into the commission, have the discussion, and the commission can order whatever remedy needs to fix the issue of enforcement or go from there. And I think it works really nicely on Nantucket for what it is. There are definitely improvements that need to be made to that system, but I think the way it sits right now is it's nice because the commission provides the nice level head that's needed sometimes to deal with situations that aren't so nice. So when the commission evaluates any project that comes within that area, the act or bylaw itself has specific interests related to resource areas. So whether it's flood control or erosion control or storm damage or recreation or wildlife, there's a whole host of them, water quality, groundwater protection. When they're talking about resource areas specifically, that's exactly how they're kind of framing that discussion. And then beyond there are standards that each resource area has that are applied when you look at a project. So the example that I gave here is one that we see a lot in the coastal area, where any activity to be in the buffer zone 2 or on a coastal bank obviously has to be restricted to have no adverse effect on bank height, stability, wildlife habitat, vegetation, wetland scenic view, or the use of the bank as a sediment source, is a performance standard that when the commission is reviewing a project and the information provided by the applicant, they're looking at all of those things, or should be looking at all of those things, to say, is this project going to have that negative effect? And if it is, can we condition the project to not? Or if we cannot, then we're looking at denying a project. So those standards are applied. Every resource area, I'd say on average, has about 6 to 8 of these, and then they're all kind of interpreted from there. So it's something where the commission really has an important job when they're looking at those to review all of these objectively. And if you're dealing with sites that have multiple resource areas, you're really thinking of how many of those are applicable and how it all kind of fits together. So it's a process that can be pretty involved depending on the level of project that you have. And it's something where, I have the easy job of just providing them information that when they're reviewing projects, I think a lot of them take a lot of time to really think about whether those activities are having those negative effects and how that kind of plays together.
We're being entirely too modest.
So I have to throw this in there because the 6 members that are on there right now, Ashley, Ian, Dave, Seth, Maureen, and Joe, do a fantastic job evaluating all of those projects and putting it together. And I had to break out Ernie separately because he just retired and left the commission after a little over 14 years of being on there and disappeared to Nebraska and will definitely be missed. And this week, the select board has we'll be appointing our new member, and we'll have to see who that's going to be. But they do a exemplary job in putting that together, and I think anyone that's been on the commission or applied to them, I think they're very fair and take their time to really make good decisions about the impacts that we're seeing to all of our resource areas, just not the coastal ones. So with that, that's a really kind of a brief 10,000-foot overview on those 2 regulations. But I wanted to leave time for questions because I'm sure people have a lot of questions about those 2 because not everyone deals with them that often. So I'm happy to take any questions or comments or concerns.
Any members of the committee have questions for Jeff before we go to the
Yeah,
public?
I have a question.
Yeah, Gary, go ahead. And use the mic, please, Gary.
To what extent, when the Conservation Commission is making decisions these days, to what extent are they taking into consideration what we're here for, what this committee is here for, is the rising tides, the change in what's happening on the waterfront areas? Can they do anything about that, or are they just stuck with, these are the rules, and even though this doesn't make any sense when you think about the rising water levels in certain neighborhoods, they say we have to approve it anyway?
Sure. So it's an excellent question, and it's something where, unfortunately, state regulations and even local regulations always tend to be a little bit behind kind of the public discussion for what's going on. But I think the commission's really taken some steps recently where they're starting to ask questions. So whether it's a bulkhead replacement downtown at the boat basin that was recently permitted, part of that discussion really centered around, well, what's the plan going forward? How are you guys addressing sea level rise? How are you guys addressing climate change when you're redesigning a bulkhead that's going to be in place for the next 30 to 50 years? How are you guys addressing that? And that was a big part of that discussion, more so than I'd say really anything else with that project. Or to go to kind of the more popular project, how sea level rise impacts structures like the geotubes in Sconset was a very big part of the discussion for the last permitting cycle, I would say, on the expansion project that the commission denied, and even the previous project that's on the ground now is looking at that 100-year flood elevation and how that's going to change, and whether or not that project, how that will function over the next, 5 years and 30 years for however long they're going to be there, is something that's really started to come into the discussion that they have. So they have the ability through conditioning to address that, or have monitoring that goes through that, and kind of look at those permits that have projects with longer lives and how they're going to be able to be adapted going forward. And I think that's something where, as the regulations catch up, that'll be something that's easier. But I know it's questions that come up a lot, and the public that come to the meeting and ask, I know we always, I think the Land Council comments on a good percentage of applications. They always ask questions like that to applicants as well. But I think that discussion is something that's already a part of what they're doing. But I think, I don't want to speak for the 6 members that are there, but I think their hopes over time is, as things like the Coastal Resiliency Plan are developed it'll give them more tools to look at to say, are you meeting the standards that that plan sets forth in addition to our regulations, and how things go together? And I think what they're hoping to avoid are situations like we see down at Easy Street already, where that bulkhead changes height like 3 times by the time you kind of wrap it around to the whole end, and it's in varying states of one project is older than the other. You know, the land bank has just permitted some just basic repair. Is how are those going to be all adapted together to provide that cohesive protection or cohesive structure to be able to manage the water in that area, and having some guidance to do that is something that I think will be helpful for them as this plan kind of comes together.
Fritz, go ahead.
Yeah, just a question, and this may get to a question of jurisdiction, but if we're looking at rising sea level and areas that might be inundated, especially low-lying areas, wetlands, and you have the 100-foot buffer now, then the 50-foot buffer. But if you're looking at rising sea levels, rising groundwater, how can you take into account septic tanks that might be built in those areas, swimming pools that might be built in those areas, other structures that would be affected by groundwater?
Well, I think that's honestly, Fritz, that's kind of the $1 million question right now is, is how do we adapt our regulations to allow for things like wetland migration and coastal resource area migration, and how that's all going to kind of work together. And I think that's why we're all here right now is to have that discussion and figure out what tools to give the Conservation Commission or what charge to give them to protect it. I mean, they're very limited by that 100-foot line for permits, but they're also charged with managing open space to some degree. So all those things kind of work together, but I think a policy from the town to address how our shorelines are going to change and roll back over time is definitely what's there. I mean, buffer zones and resource areas, obviously, if you've permitted something today and you have a coastal bank that's eroding and your 50-foot setback is here 5 years from now and maybe 10 feet inland, and what was once a conforming structure may not be a conforming structure anymore. And I think that's something that the commission wrestles with a lot. And it's difficult to project and get ahead because you don't want to deny legally granted uses on the unknown a little bit. So I think how that's all going to put together, well, hopefully, I don't want to be putting too much pressure on the committee here, but hopefully as that plan comes together, and I know it's something that I'm glad this is the week after Jen and Sarah's presentation, because I think it's really important for us to focus on how our beaches, dunes, and banks are going to move in areas where those are, but really more importantly, those areas that help protect our salt marshes, our vegetated wetlands, how those are going to migrate over time and as well, and step back and be in areas that where they are now in 20 years, they may be further inland than they are, and how we're preparing for that in advance, and how we're looking at those in a regulatory framework to say, do we need to protect those buffer zones more to allow for that to happen as nature wants it to happen? How do we do that? How's that regulatory framework look? And how does it make sense? And how do we do it?
Sarah, go ahead. Yeah.
So you may have said this in your presentation, but this thought just came to me about obviously the coastline is one thing, but the Concom has jurisdiction over the wetland boundaries. How often are wetlands redelineated? So as things start to move, is there a timeline or?
Sure. So to touch on that, I didn't talk about inland wetlands at all. So when we look at vegetated wetlands or bordering vegetated wetlands, those are areas that if you've received a permit, that delineation is valid for 3 years. We do ask, though, that if you're going to apply for new work, that you provide us the data that's within 6 months of application. So when we look at delineating vegetated wetlands, we're looking kind of at 3 components. We're looking at the vegetation that's present on the site and identifying the plants and their cover and what kind of habitat those plants need. So just quick comparison that winterberry likes wetter soil than arrowwood, then likes wetter soil than sassafras, and kind of how we look at those. Nantucket's kind of funky because a lot of our plants are very confused and migrate through all of the zones that they're not supposed to be in pretty readily. So vegetation can be a little bit spotty on Nantucket for true delineations unless it's really obvious. I prefer, and I think we get better delineations on Nantucket by looking at soil characteristics. And when we look at those, what we're looking for is the presence of groundwater within the upper 18 inches of soil for a majority of the year. So we're looking for things like mottling or organic streaking or soil types or all of the fun things that you get in dirt that you can use to see whether there's water in the soil. And then the third component is just kind of what the site looks like, whether you're seeing, water stained leaves or you're seeing, watermarks on trees or shrubs or topography that's restrictive to hold water in certain areas. It's kind of the, I don't know, when we take everyone out, we always kind of say it's just kind of the zen of the site where you just kind of look around and use your eyes and ears and see what's there. I think there's real value in, taking 5 minutes just to see, what birds are you seeing, what mammals are you seeing, what kind of reptiles or amphibians are on the site and what areas are they using, and really kind of seeing how the site works. And I know that's kind of the nebulous criteria, but it's the three that we kind of look at when we review those, and we require that information to be within 6 months of application, even on a wetland line that's valid, just to be able to reconfirm those for vegetated wetlands. So the other inland resource areas, things like, ponds and inland water bodies and isolated land subject to flooding, which is, the area around wetlands that water can just collect, is a little bit different, but those are kind of the basic areas. But it is something that we look at, and coastal resource areas tend to be much more dynamic. So our policy for those are that same kind of 6 months, with the one exception being eroding coastal banks. We usually require things to be as current as possible for what that actual location is.
Jen, go ahead.
Jeff, do you know if there's any conservation commissions in Massachusetts yet that have added sea level rise based performance standards? Because it just seems the more we talk about how you get regulations out there, that having the Concom as a regulatory board with our coastlines might be one of the best ways to think about that.
Absolutely. So that is all of the rage right now in the discussion through the Massachusetts Association of Conservation Commissions, is how this is going to be put together.
Okay.
And the state is also talking about it as well. I know the state, they've been threatening for 20 years, but apparently really have it put together now, where they're actually going to be looking at performance standards for the first time for things like land subject to coastal storm flowage. So I think if we have this same conversation, in 2 years, I think the answer will be a lot. And the state will hopefully have some too. But right now, it doesn't seem like, I feel like everyone is kind of band-aiding it right now and kind of driving it application by application, because no one has really put pen to paper yet for something that's
So no
been,
one's actually incorporated it yet into any
not that
bylaws
I've run into. And more importantly, for a lot of these things as they go to, no one has had a rule or regulation put in that deals with sea level rise or climate change that's been challenged in court at this point, because that's really kind of the big moment for all of those once they have been challenged and either get upheld or moved around. So it'll be an exciting 5 years, I'd say, as we see those things kind of come online and people get told no and challenge it and push it and see where it goes. So
Jeff, are there any other activities that you're aware of at the state level to revisit these wetlands protection regulations?
Sure.
Not just specifically in terms of climate change, but are they revised frequently? Or
Yeah, I feel like they roll out little revisions kind of on an annual basis at least. Mm-hmm. Some of them are as simple as one of the ones this year changes a notice requirement for permits to get back to DEP from having to be via mail. They can do it electronically now. So you see little tweaks to it yearly. You don't see a lot of big wholesale changes very often, but they do have to go through a public hearing process. Just like any other rule or regulation for big changes to the regulations that are there. The act itself hasn't been changed in a very, very long time because that's through Massachusetts legislature. So that's about the most painful way to go through it. So the regulations, again, get annual updates and things, but we haven't seen any really big significant changes. The last ones that were probably 2 years ago, where they included a number of exempt activities through the state act. But a lot of those activities are still required permit through our local regulations. And there are things as simple as, under the state act now, you can create a up to 3 foot wide walking path with a mower without permit. And that's something that we still require on Nantucket for people to come in and get permits for work in our buffer zones and resource areas to do. They've excluded some things for, utility installations and other things, but our local regulations still require permits for those. So,
And one follow-up. So all of these regulations apply equally to the town wanting to do something, like repair the town pier or do work at Children's Beach. That's the same set of regulations. that
sure.
apply.
Yeah, the town itself doesn't have any exemptions from these regulations. They still have to apply. The town's one of our more frequent applicants. The only real activities that are exempted through Wetlands Protection Act are agricultural exemptions. So if you run a farm that qualifies under 61E as an agricultural operation, you're exempt from application for the activities related to your agricultural operation. So if you're Bartlett's, they're the best example. If you are, planting seeds and tilling and doing the normal farming activities like they do, and you can see all the giant puddles out at Bartlett's that, if they let go, would probably be wetland resource areas and spots. They're allowed to do that. However, when they came in to install their new solar array, because that's not part of their agricultural operation, it may supplement it, but it's not direct agricultural use that required a permit. So they don't have carte blanche to do whatever they want. They have to stay kind of within the confines of their agricultural uses. So
Wetlands, can they, to turn it into fields, is that?
if they wanted to convert new area that's currently wetland to field, that would require a filing. But if it's currently within agricultural use, they can maintain that use. So they can do things like irrigation ditching, and they can move water around and alter those areas pretty heavily. But if they were, I think for their example, if they wanted to get that area right adjacent to the Hummock Pond Road bike path across the street from Millbrook and try to turn that into a farm field, they would have to apply to do that. But I don't think they would ever want to take on the headache of trying to turn that into actual usable fields.
Do we have a sense of what other communities are doing in terms of whatever you want to call it, interpretation, how aggressive, vigilant, whatever word you want to use, are compared to Nantucket?
Well, that's a good question. I like to think that we do a very good job here. It really varies. There are a lot of
I
communities.
wasn't suggesting we weren't doing what we were supposed to. I'm suggesting whether there are communities that are being, I shouldn't use the word vigilant. More,
Well, it's interesting because the state's a very diverse state as far as how these rules and regulations apply. The farther west you go, you obviously, if we live the blessed life of being like the Springfield Conservation Commission or out in the Berkshires where they don't have coastal resource areas, they're living the dream because they only have to do half the work. So a lot of those commissions, a lot of those towns don't even have local regulation or local bylaws. A lot of them just use the state act and apply through that way. Nantucket has always kind of been ahead of the curve as far as those go. You see a bit on the Cape where some of their commissions are very active. The Vineyard's kind of a mixed bag between all of the different towns that are there. But Nantucket does a tremendous amount of applications. So I think kind of what's telling in the commissions that tend to be a little bit more ahead on regulations are the ones that have had the most applications and had the most challenges to the rules. And I think a lot of times we sit down and say, that's something we need to address in the regulations because we hadn't thought of that before, and you just get that exposed through applications. So Nantucket has seen right around 3,300 notice of intent applications since we kind of fired up the machine here. So comparatively, some of the towns in Western Mass are still in like the 100 to 150 range. I mean, it varies a lot for what it is. For a town that we are for this small, we have a tremendous amount of applications that go through. So our rules are probably some of the more progressive and current, but there's definitely always room for improvement in all of those as we kind of see it. And hopefully we'll sit down. We try to get to it every 2 or 3 years for regulatory updates, depending on application load and how busy the commission is. So we're a little bit overdue, but we are definitely due for a little bit of an overhaul on a few of our regulations. So hopefully in 2020 that will take place.
Okay, from the public, do we have comments specifically on this presentation? And if you do, would you go to a mic? And hopefully the mics are working. Carol? Would you go to the mic, Carol, so we can hear the... Yeah.
Yes, hi. Thank you, Carol Beller, Brand Point Association. I have one question.
Sure.
About the coastal beach restoration. Who's in charge of that? What agency or policy governs restoration of beaches on Nantucket?
All right, so if anyone didn't hear, the question was about who is responsible for coastal beach restoration on Nantucket. So hopefully, I'll try my best to answer that, but I may have a question or two to do so. As far as coastal beach restoration, is that in a like erosion protection sense, or is that in a
Protection and replenishment.
Sure. All right. So most of the projects on Nantucket are currently private projects. The town hasn't engaged in any really nourishment-specific projects. And unlike a lot of, as you move a little bit further south in America, if you get into like Florida, where there's really large-scale beach nourishment projects, Nantucket hasn't started to do those types of projects yet, so that are driven through the municipal government. So we're not doing offshore mining and putting it out on the beach. We're still kind of blessed with the fact that our beaches are still relatively whole and maintaining themselves. So any project that you see currently, so if you went around the island and you see projects where there's nourishment material being placed to cover some sort of stabilization option, those are all typically privately done right now.
And with public beaches that have had erosion, they're not under any...
So the only public beach where there's a project now is the beach in Sconset, and that's something where, again, a private group has licensed that land from the town for that project and that specific purpose. But there aren't any active beach nourishment projects on publicly owned beaches at this point.
Okay. Any further questions on the presentation or for Jeff? All right, thank you, Jeff.
No problem. If anyone has any questions going forward, I mean, Vince is here, but feel free just to give a call or shoot an email and we'll try to get back to it. Or I know they're appointing someone this week, but we do have seats that will be open on the Conservation Commission in June potentially. And anyone that's interested in applying or knows anyone that wants to apply, we definitely encourage people to do so. So hopefully we'll see lots of applicants for the next ones.
All right, thank you, Jeff. So our next agenda item is discussion of the Stratford, Connecticut Coastal Resilience Plan and general discussion on the types of plans that Nantucket may need. So that will be led by Vince Murphy. Vince, would you start by just bringing us up to date on where we are on any current efforts with the Coastal Resilience Plan? I don't know if there's any new news since you've been on vacation and came back.
Yes, we're pretty much where we were beforehand.
Okay.
I'm still writing the draft of the RFP. Once I have it written, I'll have to go through internal review. And then at that point, once we've been through some internal review, I'll be able to bring it to this committee before it will go through the finance department and procurement so that it can then be advertised.
Okay, thank you.
So that is the stage that we're at. I'm still writing it.
Okay. So go ahead with Stratford, Connecticut.
Okay.
And Vince had given us a handout, I don't know if people still have it with them, what he was looking for from the committee for us to read the Stratford, Connecticut plan and focus on sections 5 and 6, and he has some questions regarding that.
So one of the other things I think I'll get to that. I don't think I do. To be
And
honest.
actually, before you start, so for the public, the Stratford, Connecticut plan is on the town's webpage for the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee. So it's available online through the town, through our webpage. Can you bring that up, Vince?
Yeah, I'm trying to.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Beg your pardon there now. Just trying to play catch up.
What they put together.
Beg your pardon. Thank you for holding with me. I had hoped to get this up beforehand. Didn't quite work out that way, unfortunately. So the Stratford, Connecticut plan, I'm just having it open up here. I wanted to ask one thing briefly. I am trying to remember if I covered this before about the types of coastal resilience plan and the 4 different types and how some are on municipal land only. Have I covered that before?
Yes, but do it again.
Okay.
I don't remember. Yeah.
Okay. So it's just something that's worth covering again, because I have a feeling that we had a lot of people missing, and of course Ian is new as well. Ian, if you care to take one of those and pass it along. So effectively, I was trying to research what kind of coastal resilience plans are out there, and they kind of fall into 4 main categories. And as the handouts make their way, you can see. So some of the coastal resilience plans just look at resilience on municipal land only. And it covers things like municipal owned land, roadways, utilities, and that kind of thing. When I dug into it a little bit further, there was also some coastal resilience plans that these kind of tend to crop up further south in Georgia, whereas coastal resilience plans on municipal land but also include specific neighbourhoods. That was an unusual one to me. Then it would leave out vast areas of waterfront land as well, which was unusual, but it's just how they chose to develop their plans. Some other coastal CRPs look at municipal land and then help develop toolkits, and that's then largely aimed at private landowners to help protect their property. That is without any real funding from towns. You might get some assistance from FEMA, but that's about the extent of it. So, pardon my spelling errors. Some coastal resilience plans look at municipal lands, not lads, and require private landowners to match the town standards. And this is something that I mentioned before. And the example here that I use for Nantucket is if you look at the Easy Street bulkhead, that bulkhead is not actually for keeping water out. That is to reduce waves, wave intensity when the roadway does flood, stop impacts on the buildings. But as Jeff pointed out in his talk, there are 3 different heights in the bulkhead between Easy Street and the new land bank properties there. And the land bank, as I understand it, have some tentative plans to try and bring them all in line, but that could be some time away. So if I can just try and find out how to put this on the screen. I have the Stratford plan here.
You might need to drag it as if this is a second screen.
I understand. There it is. That was massively unhelpful. So the Stratford plan is in category 1 effectively. This only covers municipal lands. It doesn't cover any private properties or private residences or any neighbourhoods or any specific residential areas. So the one thing that I want to get across to everyone is the implementation. You can go through the whole history of the plan, how they developed it, the research they did, their basic approach is, what is resilience? Trying to understand the methodology. Then there's the coastal hazards. This is the risk assessment effectively. And then the bit that I really want to talk more about, they talk about various strategies, what can you do in specific areas and under specific conditions, but it's the plan implementation is the part that I really want to get to. So sections 5 and 6 were what I asked people to just have a little look at in advance, but not necessary to do, because effectively, just going to try and skip down, try and have a little look at those. The types of strategies in section 5 are where they outline how to use bulkheads, when should walls be put in place, when are levees appropriate. So they just skip through the strategies in that. And then this nice little map here shows where they intend on implementing each one of those strategies. Red are levees for the most part. So this area down here within Stratford in Connecticut is mainly an industrial area, and that's how they intend on defending most of the area down here to keep the airport dry effectively. Then the one that I want to talk about most is implementation. Beg your pardon, now it's quite a distance down. There are numbers in this chart that frighten me, but I want people to understand. Sorry, this is an implementation matrix. This is where they effectively decide what approach to use. So whether it's to protect it, accommodate, or retreat, and then they prioritize things. This is kind of something that myself and Mary have spoken about a little bit, but this is something I wanted to bring up with the whole committee, to understand that you have to prioritize, say something on Nantucket for the sake of argument, Easy Street, Washington Street, Brand Point, those are low-lying areas that are already suffering high tide flooding and coastal and inundation. They would be subject to being, say, high priority. But there's other things that would be potentially medium or low priority. Those are things that we can still consider but leave off for a little bit later. Those might be things like the airport itself. Our airport is quite stable at the moment. The impacts there are more on the kind of 10 to 50 year timescale, as opposed to some things, say, like Easy Street, which is regularly impacted. We want to get those into the high categories. So I want to get the committee thinking about things in those terms. Say another thing that might be in kind of the more medium priority might be something like the steamship dock itself and the Highline dock on Strait Wharf, all that area. So they are already suffering impacts. We need to get, they're part of our main commuter routes for getting people on and off the islands. So they might be more medium priority. So I want to get people looking at things in those kind of terms. But then there's the numbers. It's the implementation costs is kind of what I want to get to next.
Can I say something while you're looking?
Got it here?
At
But
that?
yes.
Okay, never mind. We can
Yeah,
wait.
yes, sir.
No, I can wait. I was just filling time. I can wait my question until you're done.
So effectively, you can see that they have developed a nice plan and they've got a nice little map here. But this is where we kind of get into the kind of numbers of it. They list out all these projects and attach an approximate cost to each one. And they go by district as well and by strategy type and priority, so that if you take all the high priority things first and say that those have to be implemented within the first 10 years, then the medium priority things could be started to get implemented now, but they could be on a 15 or 20 or 30 year time frame. That's kind of how you have to look at this table. And then the really frightening bit is at the bottom. You have to remember that this project is effectively over 80 years. This runs up to 2100. So they're talking over the whole lifespan of the project up to $230 million. And that's just for one town in Connecticut, over 80 odd years. Sir?
So all the things that you pointed out were things that I really appreciated about this plan, was that they had that, high, medium, and low, and they kind of laid it all out and had even had the cost on there, because I think if we get to that point, or maybe I should say when we get to that point, then when the grant opportunities or certain opportunities come up, we can kind of, we already have it laid out. So even if it's a medium priority thing, but it fits like the grant RFP, that, we can take advantage of that. But I think before we even get to this, I think all those things that you mentioned of certain neighborhoods and infrastructure that are high, medium, and low that we can just think of off the top of our head, I think this plan does a really good job of laying out the groundwork, or laying the groundwork, or kind of being a bit of a cookbook for us in some ways. And I think if we go back to their methodology, they took a step back and did that. I loved the figures in the beginning that were just like high, medium, and or what the risk factor was.
Yeah, they had lovely
at different
categories
time
included.
scales too. So that's something that we talked a lot about the last meeting, is what time scales are we planning for? And they liked that they had 4 different, or 3 or 4, I can't remember what it was, 3 or 4 different time scales to look at. And I think that that's where I see us starting our work, because I think if we can't start building that table until we build out the risk part.
So this is one of the things that I'm building into the RFP, that obviously a risk assessment will have to be undertaken for, in some cases, neighbourhood by neighbourhood, and in some other cases, particularly in the downtown area in Brand Point, street by street. You might even have to break streets into smaller areas just to adequately get a good enough plan for some of the more at-risk properties. And I've seen that in 1 or 2 plans as well. Some of the best CRPs seem to be coming out of Connecticut for whatever reason. There's 1 or 2 that are in Massachusetts, but they had issues or ran into funding problems halfway through or whatever, and then the plans never turned out terribly well. I also have heard of several other towns, including, say, Marblehead, who are just starting the same process as us. And they got the whole purpose of how we managed to become ready to do Coast Resilience Plan is because, it's a shame Holly Backus isn't here, because we have the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness plan in place, and that recommended the Coast Resilience Plan. Marblehead got their plan in MVP status in 2018, and they're only getting around to where we are now. We got our MVP status in April of this year, and pretty much straight away launched into the process of getting staff and committees, etc., in place to get the plan in place. We're doing pretty good in terms of how other towns are doing.
And that was one thing that struck me about the plan implementation in section 6, that little like box chart, because we're already at step 2, but we kind of skipped step 1, which was like adopt the plan. So I think I was wondering from you, I know we talked at one point a few meetings ago about the timeline for the RFP, because obviously there's the writing it and all the approvals and then getting it out and getting, so by the time we actually hire someone to write a plan, it's going to be a ways out. So aside from us commenting or helping with the RFP, are there things that we can do as a group to start to get some of it going? I don't know if that's a reasonable question.
I appreciate that. So I'm nearly done writing is the basic answer.
Okay.
Hopefully late this week, early next week, we're going to start the internal review, and I got to get 2 to 3 people to review it internally before it can then come here. I was hoping, fingers crossed, maybe by the first meeting in January. I think that's January 7th. That's subject to this committee agreeing new meeting dates, by the way. Then at that point, hopefully you'll be able to see what's there and then suggest any changes and make it, more appropriate to how this committee sees it should move forward.
And yes, that's exactly why we wanted to discuss, setting up for January, because I think that is a high priority for the committee to start thinking about this in real time.
Can I, just to kind of back up a little bit of what, Sarah said, I think we've definitely been as a committee in a learning period, but I think we're all probably feeling like maybe there's something a little more active we should be thinking about. And I know Sarah and I have pushed this forward, but the idea of starting to identify those at-risk areas, I think those are things we could do as a committee in kind of a meeting that's a workshop setting, or start to decide, I'm looking at the types of resiliency plans that you have listed here, and it seems like most of them are primarily focused on municipal lands, but the more we talk about things for Nantucket, I think we should be thinking about Nantucket as a whole, and whether that's toolkits or doing things to the Concom. But I think us starting to have those discussions, because I think having what what we think as being appropriate for the plan in mind, even before we review an RFP. I feel like there's work that we could potentially be doing that would be helpful, but.
So just to kind of address that point somewhat, I'm sorry that you feel like you're not getting work done. You are, but the downside is I also am annoyed because I was hoping to have some documents to be able to bring to this committee before now. There's one document that was been commissioned by the town through Malone and McBroom for coastal resilience strategies, so that the committee could then start looking at strategies and where they might be put into place. That has not yet come through. So we're short on these kind of things that were commissioned a long time ago. It's a slow process. So I can only apologise on that front. And I've been working with Chuck Larson to try and find out when will Malone and McBroom finally deliver this that they promised a long time ago. Sent us a draft of that was slightly inadequate, and then we suggested many changes, and they promised, 10 days, 2-week turnaround 2 months ago. So I'm still chasing things like that, which will be incredibly useful for the committee.
And we did have some public sessions in the last couple of years, so I don't know if there is a list already identified from those sessions. I don't know if one was like focused on town or if there was one that was island-wide. I'd have to go back and look at them. But we have, the public has been involved in some preliminary work about gathering input to say, what are the risky scenarios that they see. Perhaps we can go back and pull out from that a starting point.
I think we've discussed a few times in this group that the public opinion part is important, but in terms of identifying risks, we really need to use science and what we already know, and we already know a lot about what the risky areas are. And not that public opinion isn't important, but I don't think that should be relied on as a starting point for what the risky areas are. I'm concerned if we start with just the people that attended those workshops and what they think the priority locations are. I think that can be an important add-on to what we think of as the risks. Mm-hmm. But I think even before that, I think I really like this plan. I think that in the sense of like how it's structured, so I don't even like helping with an outline and starting with some of the beginning parts. I mean, I know we're not charged with writing the plan. We're charged with helping the select board and helping the consultants, but I feel like it's going to be like 6 months out at least before someone's hired. So I guess that's where I was coming from, is things like the purpose, our goals, and helping set some of those things. I don't know.
So just to address the 6 months out part, hopefully we'll have a consultant a lot before that, if all goes well.
Oh, good.
So now that the RFP is in at least a draft form that is ready for internal review, once this committee and everyone is happy with it, even in finance and procurement, so that it can get advertised, then at that point, hopefully mid-February, if we're lucky, end of February, hopefully it'll get advertised at that point. Usually there's something like a 3 months turnaround time after that. Mm-hmm. And then usually it's contracts stipulate that, there's usually a set number of days. Work must begin within, say, 30, 60, 90 days, whatever. But that's kind of up to the consultant as much as anything else. But we can obviously help guide that as well.
Mm-hmm. And whoever's cell phone is going off, would you do us a favor of silencing that, please? Yes, Chris, go ahead.
What we've been looking at and what we've been talking about most immediately was sort of projects in terms of places and things and, barriers or that type of thing. The other thing that I think we need to focus on, or should be focusing on, would be what regulatory changes. So within that area of projects, will we be defining, or shouldn't we be defining what regulatory changes need to be made, who they need to be made by? And I think to some extent, to a great extent, it would be helpful in actually defining what we think those changes ought to be, as opposed to saying to the planning board, oh, go make some changes to deal with coastal resiliency, because then there won't be any. I think we need to be all coming from a common base and understanding, as opposed to assuming that some other board is just going to do all of this and come up with what we think is important in terms of regulatory changes. I mean, we're represented here by, the planning board, the select board, Concom, we have representatives. So somehow I think we need to be working that in as well. And I think that, I don't know to what extent the consultants will be identifying that or can identify those changes, since they seem to be more, what does this community need, as opposed to all communities need.
So in the structure of almost all coast resilience plans, including the Stratford one, there is a whole section that outlines some of the regulatory changes that might be implemented, and it just lists them. Some of them are kind of rubber stamp type things. They take FEMA standards and say, go with freeboard +2, +3, stuff like that. It increases the height above FEMA flood standards. There's also other regulatory things like, should you even develop in certain areas? Should you continue to allow homes to expand and grow in certain areas? I think that's something Matt has mentioned as well before in some of these meetings. But those are the kind of things that you see in a lot of these different types of reports, and I'm glad you bring it up, because it's one of the things that I've written into the RFP so far is, to review and recommend any potential regulatory changes. Then it would be for this committee potentially to say, all right, okay, fine, these are nice ones. These are the ones that could potentially be implemented by Nantucket in one way or another through the planning board, or maybe even potentially through Concom, to then develop Concom's remit to take in some elements of sea level rise.
Okay.
Gary, go ahead.
So I sense a little bit of frustration by some of my colleagues here, and I have the same frustration that by the time you get the RFP done, by the time the town approves it, by the time we find someone, and by the time he or she develops a plan, we'll be waiting till July of next year to get the final plan, and we're going to be meeting, whether we're meeting every 2 weeks or every month, doesn't matter. We want to do something before then.
Okay.
And so the question is, what value can we start adding now, thinking about and looking at some of these plans that you presented to us, show us some of the major issues. One of them that, from the information you submitted to us, the financing of this, Section 6 talks about financing, and this unit, or this town, indicated that they got most of their financing from the federal government. So the question is, I don't want to lose 8 months or 6 months between now and then figuring out which portions of government financing might be available to us to start doing what we eventually decide we want to do. I just think that I'm trying to figure out
So are you suggesting
how we
that
can
you
look
might
at these macro issues and add some value between now and the time of a report. By the time the report comes out, we want to at least start thinking about how should we choose between high, medium, or low risk.
Okay.
Is it population density? Is it economic value to the island? Well, those are issues, macro issues.
So
we can talk about those in the next few months.
Yeah. So are you potentially suggesting setting up a subcommittee potentially to investigate financing? Is that something you're suggesting?
The question is, I don't know if we are qualified to do that. The question is, who is best designed? The towns that are successful in dealing with these issues are the ones that have figured out how to obtain federal or state financing. And I know from my activities in other nonprofit organizations, some of them have done really well because we have been able to hire people who know how to obtain financing that is available through federal, state, or municipal funding.
So just to jump in there, so subcommittees is an idea that we brought out early on and haven't talked about, and we can revisit that. But the other thing I want to remind everyone, as a committee, we have no money. So if any work is going to be done, it's going to be done by the individual sitting at the table. There is no money for a consultant or for any research access or any travel or anything else. And so it's up to the people at the table to decide what they want to contribute to those efforts is essentially where we are. And subcommittees would be a great way to begin, harnessing that energy and putting it to good use. So if that's something we want to do, we should definitely talk more about that. Vince, did you want to add something?
I was just a little confused because we started talking about how people didn't think they had much to do, and then suddenly it changed direction. I was kind of unsure there for a second. But if a subcommittee answers some questions, excellent. But just to kind of segue into other things that the town is doing, so there's a sustainability group within the town. It includes myself, Jeff Carlson, Holly Backus, Chuck Larson, Greg Tiven, Lauren Sinatra, the energy coordinator. And what we do collectively is we're trying to find projects that can be funded through various state and federal grants and outside grants and that kind of stuff as well. One of the things that has been talked about is potentially trying to find someone to work with us as a grant writer, which I think that the town would benefit from personally, but I think they're trying to evaluate the economics of that at the moment, or even if that could possibly be a position. That's something that I don't want to comment too much on because, I don't want to raise anyone's hopes, but it would be a beneficial thing. At the moment, it's down to people like myself to try and find and apply for these grants.
So Mary, if this is such an important, which we all believe, initiative, why don't we ask the select board, however you do it, to give us some funding so we can actually get some stuff done prior to the time that we finally get the report in place? In other words, I hate to think that an important initiative like this is not deserving of some funding from the town so we can actually hit the ground running.
It depends what we need the funding for.
Well,
though.
we would have to go with a proposal with specifics. We can't just say, could we have some money, please? But Gary, if that's something that you have thoughts about, why don't you send them to Vince and me, and we'll put it on an agenda for another meeting. But
we're talking now about on the emails I get, I know people are talking about warrants, stuff like that. I'm not familiar with exactly the process, but the way you get funding, I guess, is to someone put something in a warrant and bring it to the town to see if the town is interested in putting a little
Matt,
money
you might
into-
be able to weigh in. Citizens articles have closed at this point.
They've closed, but
Yeah.
the select board could put it through.
Yeah.
It could be on a warrant, or it could just be through, it depends what the ask is. If
We're
the
not
ask
talking,
is-
we're not talking millions of dollars.
So if the ask is small, then it might be able to fall into, under the select board or under one of the department's budget. But if it's larger, it won't.
no.
And I think that the ask has to be, what is it, what's the goal, what is it gonna, if Libby can justify it, and then it's a little easier to get.
Okay.
But it has to be specific. It's not just a generic, can we have some money, please?
So is there any particular project that anyone would have in mind?
Well, I have a general question as I'm trying to get up to speed here. I'm assuming that the RFP is going to be to hire a consultant who is going to actually cost out what we have agreed in advance are the different priorities, right?
Not necessarily. They would help to develop the risk assessment for what would be most at risk, and then from that evaluate what the priorities should be.
So who's going to provide the cost analysis? Because that, of course, is critical going forward.
So yeah, consultants.
All right. So then, so the consultants come after the RFP, or surely the consultants could be bidding on the RFP?
Yes. And then whatever the hired consultant group is, they will generate a document similar enough to this, I should hope, with approximate costs for a lot of different strategies. They could even say, take one street, and I use Easy Street a lot, so I'll just do that. They could come up with 1, 2, 3 different scenarios for Easy Street and how we might control the flooding issues there. It could be a lot of seawalls, it could be pumping, it could be combinations, it could even involve potentially some green infrastructure. And then between the town and probably this committee, decisions would be made which method to choose.
So backing up for a minute, going back, I think, to what Vince said, it was town meeting of 2019, just April of this year, when we voted to spend the money to get a plan. Is that right, Matt? And to hire Vince and create his position and to create this committee. So in terms of government speed, we are blazing along, just to remind everybody of that. But I think, Gary, I think you have an excellent point, is if there's something that we know we want to do, then we should ask for whatever funds are necessary to do that. But step one is we've got to agree on what that thing is that we know we want to do and what it might cost.
And by the way, I'm happy to do whatever paperwork and start application processes through Mass DEP or whatever it might need to be just to get a project off the ground. I'm very happy to start on that. Just need to identify a project first. But one of the key issues and one of the reasons why we need a coastal resilience plan is to have the risk assessment to identify what's most at risk.
Sarah?
So when I was looking at the plan, the Stratford plan, because me saying that about the RFP and hiring being 6 months out wasn't a criticism. It was more like, I know the speed of things, right? So, but because we're meeting regularly and we want to get things done, I don't think, for me, I don't feel like we're at a stage of putting projects forth, but like I was reading this and looking at their table of contents, even if we take things out or don't use their exact plan, but the table of contents serve as a really good roadmap. And in the very beginning, in my notes, I wrote the table of contents, the beginning is just what we already know. And so the consultant coming in isn't going to be an on-island agency. So if we as a committee or as a subcommittee that I would be happy to be part of, got some of the background information together that could serve as the beginning of the plan, but also the here to the consultant. I feel like that's where our strengths come from. We represent different committee, already other town committees and things. So obviously we won't have all of this, like the different things of the plan, but kind of the coastal setting, the descriptions, the topography, the information we had, a lot of what Jen and I presented, not just our work, but the work of other people that we presented last time. We have a lot of this stuff that we can kind of borrow and, put into an introduction of sorts. And so I think working on that either as a subcommittee or this committee might be a way that we can start to move forward. I know that's not solving anything, but it's starting.
So we're actually also sadly describing some of the hopeful final contents of the Malone and McBroom strategies document, because they have done some of that work already, which should take some of the early heavy lifting from our coastal resilience plan if the consultants were to choose to use it. But sadly, again, it has not been delivered.
Well,
a lot of the work has been done and delivered in other plans, so the hazard mitigation plan and other things, even like the town's master plan and the neighborhood area plans. A lot of that work is there if it was simply brought together in this setting.
Yeah.
So I don't want us to reinvent either.
No, that's what I'm saying. We have all this information. We could just start to put together, because we just keep kind of talking about it again and again. Yeah. And I think, like Jen was saying, we're at the stage where we're kind of on the same page. And so if we can move forward, because even the Stratford plan, I loved that they said, they would say something and then say, as seen in the blah, blah, blah plan from 2014. They already had other plans too. And so it's kind of even a good model in that sense too.
So, Sarah, this is one of the reasons, because, first of all, sections 1 through 4 were background for that town. And for us, that would be kind of copy and paste from other things. That's why I initially asked for people mostly to look at sections 5 and 6, resilience strategies, and then implementation. That's kind of where I'd really like this committee to kind of focus on a lot of things, because the background is stuff we know. The background is stuff that can be written quickly or already exists. It's not an issue. So when it comes to the strategies, this is where we really need the consultants to look at, say, an outside eye coming in and saying, all right, people have identified this street or this neighborhood as a problem. Now, what can that consultants recommend? That's what we really need more than anything. That's kind of why I'm rushing with the RFP.
So one of the thoughts that I had is that Nantucket, even compared to a town like Stratford, is of such tiny scale. We're talking about property by property in terms of the changing conditions. One may have a bulkhead, one may not, or different heights or whatever. Would it be appropriate in the plan to address a property by property scale, or is that too much work for a plan to do? Is that too detailed?
So this is something that I've actually thought quite a bit about, and this is something that in some areas potentially, if you take waterfront, and even potentially one of my favorite new things is buildings over water, the buildings that are on the piers, how you can group those, say, into just the buildings on, say, Straight Wharf, and then take another group and say it might have to look individually at, say, the buildings on North Wharf, and then there might be 2 or 3 buildings you can group together and say this is what these buildings might have to do. But yes, that is one of the things that you might have to get down to the real fine scale on. Then, say, for other parts of the island, you can just look at whole communities and just say, right, this is a more broad area that, is much more easily dealt with as a large scale.
Is that kind of grouping then an appropriate focus for this committee to not send that to a consultant, but to do that work? Because we're the ones here. We can meet with the Mattocket Area Association and find more about the individual aspects of their neighborhood. Yeah. We can meet with whatever association. Perhaps that's a good direction for us to go. And I'm just throwing that out there. I would love to hear what other people think. Just a moment, Kara. Anyone? Jen? Yeah.
Thank you, Mary. I think that kind of goes into what I was starting to say, is if there are tasks that we as a committee can accomplish instead of farming out to a consultant, then that consultant can be used to either proof some of the stuff that we've already done, add to it, or then work in other directions. And if, like, identifying the critical low-lying areas, which is something we've all talked about but haven't actually worked on yet, those resources exist for us to at least begin to identify what we think those are, and then we'd have that information that could then be provided for consultant versus them doing that work. Additionally, like if there are tasks like that along what you're saying that we could accomplish in the next few months, it feels to me like that might be useful. And I'm sure there are others, and maybe we just need to have an initial brainstorming session that breaks down the categories in which we could potentially focus, and then 2 or 3 people could then focus on a subcommittee on a particular issue, if that made sense.
No, I'm very happy to do that, and that sounds wonderful, but this is something I need to know about pretty much now so that I can write that into the RFP so that a consultant wouldn't be surprised by information that they would have to use or have to refer to. So this is also something that I'd have to really get right.
So one of the things I go back to is the charge that we got from the select board, and I think that's where we would start. That's what we were asked to do. So one of the things, just off the top of my head, I don't have the thing memorized, was that we were asked to make sure that all of the areas of the island were considered. And so it seems to me that following that direction is something that we could do. And I'm just making this up on the spot, Vince. So could we put something in the RFP to the effect that the consultants would be responsible for coming up with solutions for each area as defined by the Coastal Resiliency Advisory Committee, by a certain date or whatever kind of language you need, so that it's workable for a consultant.
I'm sure I could put that language in. Yeah. How about I try and develop something?
Okay. And bring it back to...
Well, develop a few paragraphs or some kind of structure to that, and get it emailed around the next few days so that I can then get it into the RFP.
Right. And any other comments from the committee? Are we all feeling positive about that direction? I don't want to... Sarah, go ahead.
I feel positive about that direction. I just want to make sure that, do we need to be specific about every little thing that we're doing ahead of time? Because I think that will stymie us to actually do work if we are only doing that.
Sorry, I don't understand.
So if we only say that, like if we're saying that we're going to be identifying the neighborhoods or the level of areas that the consultants need to design projects around whatever the language is.
Yeah.
I think that's wonderful. I think that's something we can definitely do. But if there's other tasks that we can also do to help the plan move forward, does that need to be in the RFP specifically at this point, or can we say because we haven't seen it yet? I don't know if it says something like working closely with the Coastal Resiliency Advisory Committee along the way or something.
If I may paraphrase, you don't want the committee to be locked into the RFP.
Yeah, I don't want it to be locked out of the RFP either. Like if we say that we're going to do this and they are working with us and you're saying we need specifics in the RFP, I just would like, since I think our charge is to work with them and help with the plan and we know the island best, I would like to make sure that we're part of that, but I don't know. I kind of assumed we would be, but I don't know if...
So that's kind of a question. How does this board work with the consultants doing the RFP?
Yeah.
When are we inserted and how? That's a good question.
Yeah.
Okay. To the way that I've read about this working, because I haven't seen it working, to be very honest, is that the consultants are just given the RFP, they go and work with it, and at the kind of 3, 6, 9 month and then final review stages, when they bring back questions at the 3 and 6 month stages, or at the 6, 9 and 12 month stages, when they actually have things that they want reviewed, that's when the committee goes through things, and it's not just one person, me, reviewing it, it will be a committee reviewing it.
It's a supervisory role.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So,
but it's not a collaborative role, is what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah. So my understanding is that it's not necessarily, why do we need consultants if the committee would then choose to do everything themselves?
Well, I think the committee might have some opinions on that. But it's a great discussion. I'm watching the clock. We have 15 minutes left to go, and I think we need to continue this. Okay. I don't know what your time frame is, Vince, but if you can draw up some examples of language that might be in the RFP, and we can take a look at them at our next meeting and say, we understand this or we don't understand this, is that potentially doable?
So, yeah, I think I can do it for certain sections, not everything, obviously. And I'm happy to also say that I've used this and the Stratford plan and other towns as kind of basis for how I'd like to see our plan kind of look. So I've written language, say, to the effect that, we must do, in some cases, community by community, in other cases, street by street, evaluations of coastal defence structures or coastal resilience structures or coastal resilience methods. Then I also have to be careful because there's other plans in the works that I also have to consider, like the Resilient Nantucket that looks after the historic buildings in the downtown area. So we will have some input there as well. The committee will, have some input there. Whereas that's kind of outside, that's kind of building by building in the downtown area, the historic district. The historic downtown district, and how those buildings will be protected over time. In those areas, this committee and me in particular will be slightly more involved with the waterfront and how to make those areas more resilient.
Are you asking me or are you telling me?
No, I'm telling you. That's how I view it.
Okay,
Yeah.
So I'm totally puzzled because surely that's the brief of this committee, isn't it? Doesn't have the oversight over the entire island.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So, yeah, we do sometimes tend to focus. Yeah, we do sometimes tend to focus on the downtown area a little too much. But you are right, and it is a whole island approach. When Malone and Mark Broom sent their first draft of their strategies document and did the risk assessment, they did 26 areas, including interior parts of the island, which effectively will have very little impact. But then when they did the downtown area, they only did 2 areas. They did downtown and Brant Point. It wasn't good enough. Their risk assessment was slightly under par in those areas, and that's one of the things that I'm very happy to say I'm hoping to improve on by having in certain areas a more focused approach. Sometimes even street by street would be much improvement in what happened before. So yes.
So I want to recap. So I think I understand and share the desire for energy and for advancement of the issues. We have to remember that we've got a lot of pieces that have not come forward yet that we really need to have in place. We have the McLone and McBroom that Vince has told us about. We have the RFP that he is writing, and we'll get to see as soon as we can. I think we need to give him a little bit more time for those things to come out before we can start saying, we need to do this or we need to do that. It's frustrating, but I think it just needs to we need to let things come out so we can have them to use for our advantage. Gary.
Something Sarah said struck me as could be an interesting exercise. Take a look at the plan that we have, that Vince sent around, right? And let's take a look at it and say, if we were doing this same plan for Nantucket, and let's very quickly, we can be doing this ourselves, right? Because we all have some knowledge about where we stand on many of these issues. The things we wouldn't replicate that's in that plan are the factual stuff, the high tides, all the measurements. The factual stuff we can collect later on and somebody else has that. But there are concepts that are very important to our ultimate plan. And when we go through that exercise and we start looking at how Stratford-on-Avon did it and how we would do it, we'd say, oh, gee, that's an important, whether the high, medium, and low risk, what are the factors? Once again, is it total population? Is it economic value to the island? Is it municipal areas or residential areas? We can really narrow down to certain areas that we say, this is what we really ought to be talking about. Number 5, the actual resilience plan projects, that's the last thing that's going to be done, because once we get all the concepts, then we'll decide, okay, based on what we believe are the right decisions we have to make. Some will be winners, some will be losers, right? We won't have money for everything. We'll have to make those decisions. And once we get those concepts decided upon, then you can pick which are the projects that fit within those concepts. But by taking a look at their plan and making believe that was our plan, and leaving out all that factual stuff, that
You've paraphrased what I was hoping for extremely well.
good, perfect.
Yeah.
We can all
But
do
that's
it.
what I wanted
And
to
we should
do.
all be doing it
Yeah.
between now and the next meeting and the next meeting, perhaps, because
if
they
you
did
read-
the work.
If you read through it and with that frame of mind, which is why I kind of wanted people to look at sections 5 and 6 more than anything, just to get the ideas of what might be implementable and where and under what conditions. We just also have to bear in mind that this was for Connecticut, and that in Massachusetts, concrete is a slightly different issue and not quite as acceptable. So permanent structures within the shoreline are less likely to get permitted here. So it's just one or two differences that we still do have to bear in mind, even though it is a good plan.
All right, we need to move on to discussion of the meeting time and date going forward. So our next,
One question there before
Yeah.
we go. You were hoping to get some direction on what we like from you on this.
Yes,
I would say 3 and 4.
sections 3 and 4.
Well, yeah, either giving a toolkit or doing
Yeah.
it in total. Not 3 and 4 here. You're
on
asking
your list.
on your
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
asking-
yeah.
Yeah.
So we've asked that for 2 different meetings, and I would
Yep.
say 3 or 4 is where we should be going. I don't think we can just look at this.
No, we're so tied together as a tiny community that we can't
Yeah.
disregard certain aspects. Leaving somebody out could affect the entire community.
So, okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. And does everyone agree with that? Is there anything else that should be caught? Yeah, just the toolkits. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, so our next meeting is scheduled Tuesday, December 17th at noon. I don't know if we'll be upstairs or downstairs. We're finding out more about the recording situation and if we've been moved here permanently for that or what, we don't know at this point.
There was an education session going on
Yeah.
upstairs, which is why the room was changed, and the room was changed, and nobody told me so that I couldn't inform you, and I'm very, very sorry about that.
So we would not meet on December 31st, which is 2 weeks after the 17th. We meet the first and third Tuesdays of the month. If we were to continue that schedule, the next meeting after December 17th would be January 7th. We had not really, when we set our schedule, we set it for the fall only. And so if there's anyone here who wants to propose a different schedule, you're more than welcome to do that.
I like this schedule. This is just for the record.
So we can continue meeting twice a month. We can change that. We can talk more about that next week. I want to make sure that we get, everybody has a chance to think about it and look at their own schedules. But Vince needs to book a room. So that's one of the reasons why this is significant now. We'd want to be able to make a decision on the 17th about what our meeting times would be in January at least, and hopefully for the next several months, so that we can reserve the room. And then the other issue is the topics. We can continue to have presentations and to learn more about our island's unique situation. We can take suggestions for that, or we could change tack and we could do a little bit more active work in our meetings. So we're open to suggestions about what people want to do next.
Well, I think the presentations have been terrific. And I'm sorry, I didn't see all of them, but I heard all of them. And I won't be seeing a lot of the future ones, but I'll hear them all. But so I think to the extent we can get that expertise, like Jeff's presentation, that was fine, teaching us, and so to the extent there are other areas that we should become knowledgeable about, I recommend that you continue doing it. At some point, there won't be a need for some additional ones, but at least for now, still in the learning mode.
So we've had suggestions for the building department, the sewer department. Are there any other suggestions right now that people want to offer? Vince?
It's come up before, and I'd like to continue. The youth of Nantucket to try and get somebody from the high school student potentially to come and talk.
Yeah. Yeah, would want to hear from people who are not immediately visible to all of us. So, other suggestions?
Would it make sense to have someone from the planning board to think about if there are ways to incorporate climate change regulations into what the planning board is doing?
Fritz, do you want to answer that?
Well, that's why specifically I said the building department. I think it would be very helpful to hear from the building department in terms of building codes and what the building codes are, how are they structured? It's a state versus local. What can we do? What can't we do? But just a basic understanding of if somebody's building in these areas, what do they have to do now?
Right.
What would we like them to do, and do we have any control over?
Yeah.
In terms of putting that to the planning board generally, I think we're better asking specific questions, and then my thought would be at some point to go to in terms of the regulatory issue that I brought up and how to address them. One of the things that I was thinking is if we could put together almost like a small questionnaire for the various departments. So it'd be for the planning department, for environmental, for health department, DPW, whatever else there might be, in terms of what changes do we have to contemplate from a regulatory point of view to be able to deal with coastal resiliency? And not define to them what that means, but to see what they have in their mind about what this means and what we might be able to do. I think it'll be an interesting exercise to see what the attitudes are of those various
the health departments
and boards.
Yeah. One of the thoughts that I have is some of our members represent other boards. So for instance, the select board gave us the charge for what this committee should be doing. Is there something from the Harbor and Shellfish Advisory Board that you want us as a committee to address? Is there something from the Conservation Commission that you want us as a committee to address, or something that we can provide to you? I'd love to hear from those other boards through their representatives on the committee. How we can work together or how we can support each other. Whatever might be in the cards there. We might ask Andrew Vorse to come and tell us more about zoning around the island and if that affects what we can do.
Yeah, building and zoning would be, I'd say, different. Could be different topics, different people probably.
I think the select board wants the plan done.
Yeah.
I mean, and a lot of this other stuff is, sort of, just talk. I mean, I think the select board would like the plan done so we can answer some of these difficult questions that come. Like, what are we going to do down on Holborn Ave? you know, and so that's, and I was looking at the, sort of GIS and just looking at the wetlands maps, and when you look down at Hulbert Ave, it's very interesting, because the delineations of some of the wetlands are, and wetlands shouldn't be like a norm, it should be kind of abnormal shaped. But then you look and the wetlands just end in a straight edge along these properties, because that, you know, and I know that my family had a property in the wharf that was filled in. All this was infill. And so I look at that and I think, you know, what are we doing how are we gonna handle it? You want some of that water to be able to flow all the way to Lily Pond again, but how will it? And so it's just interesting, like, we're assuming people are assuming a set thing and it's gonna be like this. Somehow we have to get into people's head that it's gonna be very different. And, you know, and we may not have the answers, but we might have to say that we should be thinking about this differently. You know, and I don't think the planning board or the building or anyone's gonna have the answers, but if you look at those wetland maps and go back and say, okay, 9 feet, blah, 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 you know, it's right up Easton Street, it's right up to Lily Pond. How do
So,
you?
in the interest of time, Matt, sorry, the charge the select board gave us was provide input as to plan modifications, updates, and finalization. If we don't have something to start with, we don't have a role in that. And I think that frustrates everybody. But I think Vince has been very good at reminding me when I'm setting agendas that the number one thing is to get the plan. And it can only go so fast.
Yeah, but I don't.
Yeah.
That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking this. So some of this is still going on. You know, some of the pressure, and it's still going on. And the sooner we can get to the point of having a plan, or even having the draft, and being able to have some suggestions, because then some of it, if the zoning change is going to have to go to town meeting in a year or 2 years or 3 years, and everyone's going to say no. But in the meantime, they're saying no to protecting themselves. They're saying no to having, you know, wetlands to take the water from their own properties.
Well, and
so somehow we have to.
the other charge the select board gave us, or one of the other ones, it was public education. And we had talked about that a couple of meetings ago. And you know, Vince with the high school connection, hopefully you've been able to connect with somebody there. I think we do need to focus on that. That is perhaps the second most important charge, is getting that word out to the public. Here's what you can expect. Here's what you can expect from the town. Here's what we're doing right now. Here's what you can do on your own property. I think that perhaps is our second most important charge. Yeah, there's what we like to do, but then there's what we've been asked to do.
Would it be helpful to have a subcommittee that's dedicated to educational materials to bring?
Getting educational materials out there, please.
So maybe that's for next time.
All right, so for the next agenda, let's talk more about subcommittees. Vince, do you need anything specific from us today on meeting dates? Are we all fine continuing the way we've been going, or do we need any further discussion on that?
It would just be a simple question. So if happy to continue with the first and third Thursdays for 2 hour meetings at midday, that's great. I can book for whatever length of time into the future, 3-6 months, something like that. And then I just need to know how far to book ahead.
First and third Tuesdays.
Correct.
Yeah, I would say at least 4 months to, or well, at least 3 months gets us to town meeting. I don't know what would change at town meeting, but it's a milestone.
Well,
Yeah.
it would be fairly easy just to say 6 months. So take us to
6
June.
months, yeah.
Okay.
No issues with that, okay. Easy to plan,
Thank you.
yeah. Right, any final comments before we adjourn? Entertain a motion to adjourn?